Hi, and welcome to the UK Desk, where we delve into the minds of the curators shaping our cultural landscape. Today I'm excited to introduce Bram Gieben. Known for his razor-sharp insights and darkly humorous perspective, Bram brings us his first collection of essays in the form of his debut book, The Darkest Timeline. If you're in the mood for an intellectual thrill ride through the dystopian facets of our society, this book promises to be your next compelling read, or kindling for your existential flame. Bram, a Scottish slam poetry champion and the creative force behind the philosophical podcast Strange Exiles, has a storied career that spans 3 decades of networked media, culture, and technology. From curating the cult website Weaponizer to running the avant-garde music collective Black Lantern, Bram's contributions to the cultural zeitgeist are as varied as they are impactful. The Darkest Timeline is his latest offering, a darkly humorous, yet profoundly thoughtful examination of our contemporary world. Welcome to the show, Bram. To kick things off, can you tell us a bit about the background and motivations behind writing The Darkest Timeline?
Sure, no problem. Well, thank you for having me on the show and giving me a chance to talk about some of these themes. I think it's fair to say that this is, the idea of the apocalypse or the end times or collapse has been, very much an obsession for me for my entire adult life. And, even going back to the things that I read and thought about as a kid, I was born in 1980. So I'm kind of on that exact cusp between Generation X and the millennials. Probably a lot of people born around them would tell you that they remember their childhood as being very analog, and then from their 20s onwards, everything becomes digital and starts to accelerate. And so in terms of, my view of the past and of the future, it's very much shaped by those two experiences. I don't want to go off on too random a tangent, but like at university, I had a pager. And if I tried to describe to somebody much younger than myself the situation and how a pager worked, if I wanted to message somebody urgently, I would find a phone box and I would put some coins into the phone box. I would then phone up the messaging service for their pager, and I would transmit a short message over the phone to a human being on the end of the phone, who would then punch it out and put it into their pager. And this person would then have to read the little thing saying you have a page and phone up to get the message and then call me back at the number which I'd give it, which meant that I'd have to be in a certain location. I'm not even sure if I'm describing it correctly now that I think about it. I think this is another artifact of time where it just seems so crazy. It's like something from a Philip K. Dick story. Now I'm describing it, and yet now I have a small computer in my pocket which has access to every single bit of human recorded knowledge. So I think to people born on that cusp, the acceleration of technology in particular is very, very, it's very, very prevalent in our thinking and in our experience of the world. I think that the dislocation that's happened between the early promise of the internet to connect people to the kind of divisiveness and misinformation and, the kind of assault on truth that's happened as a result of internet culture, that's all happened in our lifetime. We've seen the collapse of things like, the journalism industry. It's much, much harder to make a living as a journalist now, and could be that, in the near future, things like even the New York Times go under. That gives me a particular framing of how I see the world that would be maybe different for somebody who was born, let's say, in 1990 or the early 2000s and who'd grown up with the internet as just a normal, natural part of life. That's what I wanted the book to act as, was like a provocation or a series of provocations to make people consider that perhaps any consolation they're taking in ideas like, technology solving this for us or governments solving this for us, and that those might be, misplaced, and that there's probably a bleaker outcome that at least is worth considering.
I was really interested in your critique of techno-optimist visions like space travel and transhumanism amidst impending crises. In the chapter Zero Future, you mention our obsession with the abstract representation of apocalypse signals our inability to confront present realities. Can you elaborate on this critique and its relevance today?
My arguments about progress are definitely very influenced by, I think I mentioned John Gray's Straw Dogs. In Straw Dogs and in other places in his writing, he writes against the notion of progress for a couple of different reasons. The first is he calls the notion of progress one of these things that we have in modern society that he calls secular heresies. And the secular heresy is anything that's a legacy of like a storyline or a theme or a framing or a theory of history that comes from the Judeo-Christian tradition. So to him, anything that has a teleological viewpoint is inherently just kind of an archetype of the Christian story of there being, a beginning and an end, the creation and judgment day and, life and the afterlife. Like that's what Christian mythology is based on, is that teleological structure of, the present world and the world beyond. And so anything that resembles that, he calls a secular heresy. Progress can look very measurable from wherever you're standing in history, but often that's because humans have a very short lifespan. So your frame of reference of what you're going to be analyzing is a couple of 100 years. So, his argument about the belief in progress is that the belief in progress is of no more value than the belief in heaven. And he gives an example of this with regards to transhumanism, particularly the notion of the uploaded consciousness. In transhumanist, ideas, the notion is that you can copy your personality somehow and upload it to the cloud. But even the cloud is, stored on physical servers. It has to be, the cloud is in a location. It might be in a number of locations that might be dispersed. But a significant enough challenge to human networks, to human infrastructure, would also erase the cloud. The writer Ewan Morrison tweeted something today which was very funny, which was talking about how if you did upload your consciousness, you'd then have to experience, adverts and interruptions in your consciousness to try and sell your products, because, you obviously only the elites would be able to afford the ad-free tier of consciousness uploading. And I make that argument in the book that why would we think that any of the promises that transhumanism makes would kind of level out or equal out society? That seems very, very unlikely, given that the people who are, espousing these ideas and pushing them forward are quite often themselves techno-capitalists.
The darkest timeline suggests that we are already living in a dystopian reality, Bram. How does our current cultural and political landscape reflect this dystopia? And in what ways does it resemble the cyberpunk narratives of a high-tech, low-life future?
Well, cyberpunk was always a warning. It now exists in an aestheticized escapist form. You can consume cyberpunk products that are themselves a form of escapism or catharsis to escape from the real world. I've talked a lot about how important I think cyberpunk is as a genre. And I think the reason it's important is that it emerged specifically in that time that we were talking about at the top of the interview, where technology was starting to shift. And the writers who pioneered it really anticipated that shift. It's a well-worn story, but William Gibson wrote Neuromancer on, a typewriter from the 1950s, effectively. So, he was imagining things like cyberspace and virtual personas and, hacking and things like this long before those things actually kind of existed. So it's already kind of proved its prescience, and it's already reached a point where it's been sort of hollowed out of, of all of its original political content in some ways. But I still think it's the most important literature to understand the present moment.
I want to delve deeper into bits you were discussing there. I don't know if you're familiar with Doomer and Doomerism.
Yeah, very familiar, yeah.
These concepts, as I've seen on internet forums and YouTube channels like Low Budget Stories, Danny Dank and Prince of Zimbabwe, reflect a bleak worldview that resonates with many people in their 20s, including myself. As a former sort of, self-identified doomer, I've noticed that this culture is characterized by fatalistic attitudes and a fascination with global crisis, expressed through such things as memes, art, edits, and music. My question is, do you see any antidote to this doomerism among young adults? Could a positive community emerge from these doomer circles, despite their current individualistic and, I suppose, somewhat pessimistic outlook?
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting question. I mean, I think like anything that got named on the internet, there's like several versions of doomers, doomerism, whatever we want to call it. Like there's kind of like lol doomer, right? There's like doomer memes. And, I've been very much consciously putting doomer memes out to promote this book. I think that there's a certain way in which engaging with funny shit about the end of the world, telling dark jokes, a little bit of gallus humor, like that is 100% a coping mechanism for human beings who are worried about change, about death, about existential things. So I think in that sense, like lol doomer could be like a pretty good thing, as well as also being potentially something that, like so much of our discourse, is like really easily weaponizable into a culture wars thing. And I think the same is true of like, if you want to group a few people under like a kind of doomer or anti-doomer banner, you could talk about people like Gieben or Arne Nace. Now, both of these are guys who proposed things like deep ecology, which is like looking at mitigating the effects of climate collapse, and also like dealing with them realistically, like confronting the fact that some ecosystems will collapse. What do you do next? Or deep adaptation, where you have schemes that are based on nurturing the bits of nature or the bits of society even that are left, rather than on moonshot projects like carbon capture or cloud seeding, or any of the other number of things that might solve something or could go wrong. But the problem with even people like Bendel and Nace is that it's very easy to take what they're saying about accepting the end of societies, of ways of life, and to kind of bend that into a narrative like that of the backwoods crank or the doomsday prepper. I mean, that to me encapsulates both my problem with and my fascination with doomer things. Is I'm watching that show and I'm thinking, okay, this person's thought about the ways in which infrastructure might collapse. They've made a plan for this aspect or that aspect. And then it always comes down to the question of, why do you think society is going to collapse? And every single person without fail is like, the Chinese are coming. Oh, we've got to worry about all the Muslims. It's like there's a sense in which I share the concerns of those people, but it comes from a very different place.
What do you think of Mark Fisher's ideas of imagining a future beyond capitalism, and how does this concept relate to our current economic reality? Are we still following at present a traditional capitalism?
We have now isn't even really capitalism and looks less like it all the time. What we have is an emerging techno-feudalism, effectively. I think Yanis Varoufakis has spoken about this quite a lot, and it's a sense that we're still calling things like capitalism, or democracy, when in actual fact there are some quite existential threats to even those concepts. Nick Bostrom is someone I reference a couple of times in the book. He's a philosopher who's written some, kind of quite provocative papers about what the future might be like, and, what the nature of our reality is even. And one of his papers is called The Vulnerable World Hypothesis. And in this, he writes about surveillance. He writes about things like drone warfare and micro-drone technology. He writes about artificial intelligence. He writes about nanotechnology and all these kinds of like potential society changing inventions that we might be on the verge of. And he also talks about, the fact that these technologies, as they proliferate and as they, exponentially get more powerful, they also get easier to use and easier to come by. And so what he ends up effectively proposing is a global government with no democracy and complete surveillance of every citizen, because he says that at some point the existential threat to human life is going to mean that freedom is the necessary cost of preventing extinction, of preventing horror. And I don't think he's making that argument to say that we should have a unipolar world order with total surveillance. He's saying that at some point, because of the technological curve we're going on, that's going to be a better bet than what we have now. And so if we want to keep what we have now, even the vestiges of those things, of our way of life, of our values, if we want to conserve those things, if we want to preserve those things and carry them forwards, then we really need to think about what they mean and how they really relate to technology. And, we don't really have safeguards in place for any of the technologies that I talk about in this book, whether it's artificial intelligence, drone technology, surveillance. Like, these are all being weaponized against human beings already. Facial recognition. You could say, okay, well, in one country here, we have good safeguards on it. Whether we do or we don't, let's say we do, there's going to be another country that doesn't. There's a cyberpunk novel by Bruce Sterling called Islands in the Net. It's from 1988. And in that scenario, basically data piracy is only not forbidden in 2 or 3 countries, and as a result those countries become the most powerful players. So I think it's things like that we almost have a generalized faith that technology is going to be moderated and managed, that it's going to be implemented in such a way that it won't really change the way we live our lives, and that we're in safe hands with it. And I think we've got ample evidence over the past 10 years that none of that's true. None of that's true at all. So yeah, we definitely live in interesting time. And I think Bostrom's right that it's going to be very hard to maintain some of the things that we think are fundamental to our ways of life, particularly in privileged, elite, Western liberal democracies. Those might become very, very hard to maintain in the face of what might be coming.
Yeah. Yeah, your points resonates with Thomas Hobbes' philosophy, at least for me. But what I'm picking up on is particularly his kind of views on state of nature and then justice and security. His argument that in the state of nature, life is nasty, brutish, and short, which kind of like makes it a necessity to sacrifice certain liberties for the sake of this security. This perspective seems relevant to what you were saying about, I guess, balancing individual freedoms with this societal safety moving forward, I guess.
I mean, it's kind of, yeah, you're right to mention Hobbes. I mean, that's the threat behind all of this, right, is the war of all against all. And really, like, I think that's what we're exploring when we watch a film like Mad Max. Mad Max is the war of all against all. But the only way that we have of understanding, Mad Max is by putting Mad Max in the middle of it as the hero who can solve or change things. That's particularly pronounced when you look at Mad Max Fury Road. It's still a heroic tale. Even though Max is an anti-hero, it's a heroic tale. Whereas if you look at the original Mad Max, which comes from an earlier time, but also a more precarious time economically, I think, in terms of the Australian, society and what was going on at the time. There's a sense that feels much, much closer to our present moment now, because it's about a normal, regular, everyday guy with a working class job. He's a policeman, and collapse starts to come for him. He starts to enter the apocalypse. Slowly, things get more and more real. He loses the things that, he assumed he would keep forever. He loses his status as an officer. He loses his family. And by the end, he's entered the war of all against all and has to make the same choices as the people who broke his world and brought him into that situation. So in a way, like, the original is the one that we should look to understand the moment now, I think,
Your Pandora Dynamics chapter examines predictive models. What ethical dilemmas arise from trying to predict and shape societal outcomes?
Bostrom's one of a number of people who was involved in the effective altruism movement. Sang Bankman-Fried, the guy who was prosecuted for the biggest, fraud in kind of a long time, crypto fraud. He was also, a big proponent of it. And I talk about that system, the name of the Scottish guy who invented it, William MacAskill. So he came up with this system called QALYS, QALYS, and it stands for Quality Adjusted Life Year. And this is a way of calculating the way of doing the most good with money. So what it allows you to do, that QALY, it allows you to make a calculation that says, if I invest $1 here, it's going to do more good than investing $1 there. Now, obviously, that's very appealing to big business. It's very appealing to anybody who, likes to donate a lot to charity in America. That's because it's tax deductible. So the whole system of donation is itself an industry. Charity is itself an industry. What MacAskill proposed with QALYS was to make that effective, to take the altruistic instinct and make it work as if by an algorithm. The problem with that is that you can use QALYS to really justify anything. You can use it to compare the quality of life of somebody who's a paraplegic with someone who's blind, and you can make a choice there over whose care you invest in. That's very, very cold, rational, deterministic way of looking at things. It also led to things like Sam Bankman-Fried's fraud. At his trial for this, billions and billions of dollar fraud, he was still saying that he believed that his actions were justified because the profits would have gone to somewhere that would have been, an effective altruist solution. And it's going to come into disrepute because not only have you got effective altruist societies buying mansions for themselves to throw events in rather than actually investing the money, you also come to this situation where morally it's okay to say it's better to go and work as a Wall Street trader and donate 80% of your income and live on the remains than it is to actually go and save lives in a country where doctors are needed. Once you do the math over how much the training costs, etc., that one is doing more good than another, there's something that you lose in not doing good yourself, I think. So Bostrom's contribution to this is what's called long-termism, and that was the idea that downstream problems like rogue AI would affect many billions more people and be an order of magnitude more serious than the threats we face now. And so we need to start long-range planning. There even leads to calculations of saying that the life of one person now is just not as valuable as the life of a billion people down the road. That's very easily a calculus that could let you get away with outrageous things in the here and now. So I think that's the risk of any kind of predictive system, is that it fixes your gaze so far into the future that you can lose all contact with the reality of here and now. Um, and that's why, I go on in that chapter to talk about the model proposed by Harry Seldon in the Foundation novels by Isaac Asimov. Because while psychohistory was a system for predicting the rise and fall of empires, the long span of history, while it was also designed, to ensure that humanity still had a history to survive into by, preventing a great crash in the species over a galactic scale, it was also an effort to preserve the culture and the traditions and the art and the aesthetics of the human race. And as such, even though the project fails as a predictive mechanism, even though it gets co-opted as an ideology and as a weapon, it still achieves its aim, which is that the foundation continues and those traditions are preserved. So I think we have real life examples of that. I write about the Embassy of the Free Mind in Amsterdam. If you ever get a chance to go, man, it's so good. It's all just ancient texts. Some of them are from very discredited ideas like Rosicrucianism, Kabbalah. They've even got some stuff from like demonology, like Christian demonology. But particularly the Jewish texts, I think, are really important. They come from a period where Amsterdam was known as a haven of tolerance. Now, tolerance doesn't mean that it was like, a paradise where everyone got along. It just meant that, Jews in particular could go there from places where they were persecuted and live without fear of being killed. They still didn't have the freedom to practice their religions in public, but they could do things like start publishing houses. And so Manasseh ben Israel and others who were involved in that publishing culture in the time managed to preserve many traditions which underpin, Jewish thought and Jewish tradition. Now, if they hadn't been able to do that, then potentially our understanding of Judaism and Jewish history would be different. One of the things that they sustained was Kabbalah. A lot of the major texts about Kabbalah are there or are influenced by texts that are maintained there. And Kabbalah, as I say, is a discredited system. Nobody really uses it to understand the world except as a kind of, we think of it along the same lines of, as I don't know, maybe you think along the same lines as Scientology, in that there is a bit of a Kabbalah cult in Hollywood. Or maybe people think of it more along the lines of like Reiki, like it's just bullshit, woo-woo, joss sticks in the air type of thing. Nonetheless, it's an important historical system. So I think, having to continue to have the urge to preserve culture, to preserve traditions, to preserve ideas, religions, stories, all of these things I think are worth preserving. And that was the best I could get as a message of hope at the end of the story, is that whatever happens, I just hope that there are still archivists among us, people who like to keep records and write down and tell stories.
One chapter that intrigued me was Liminal City of the Spotless Brand, which critiques the transformation of urban spaces by corporate interests. What do you think are the broader societal implications of these commercialized environments, Bram?
Yeah, I think there's a ton of good consequences for them. And what I was trying to communicate there was the way that, cities can just feel very unwelcoming and inhuman. And that's not just the fact that so much public space is being colonized by corporations. It's also to do with the fact that capitalism tries to manage those spaces, and that's particularly true in any city that, needs redevelopment. Is that redevelopment can really be only driven by investment from the private sector, in the way that the societies that we've got at the moment are set up to run, particularly in the UK. So you end up with these kind of corporate zones within a city that have no character, because chain places, whether you're talking about a McDonald's or whether you're talking about Vinoteca, they're very different ends of the scale in terms of what they serve and what the experience is like. But the idea is the same: is to get you in, get you to spend money, and then get you out. Now, obviously, independent businesses, pubs run by independent people, they want you to come in and spend money too. But they're also trying to create a particular atmosphere or an aesthetic. You know what I mean? So I think like that's what I was talking about is the fact that they've become corporate zones, our inner cities, rather than places where people come to start a business and make money and create their own particular slice of it. You know, and I think as well, it's like there's just a lack of novelty in a city like that, which I think can be quite depressing as a human being. We like to see the strange and the unusual. Most people, I think, like a little bit of variety. It's very hard to find that in some cities, and I think there's just a risk that because we do have so many cities where the like I live in a town where the level of investment in the city centre has been sorely lacking for years and years and years. My wife used to live here in the 1980s, and the high street was like a place where people would come to gather. There were good shops. Now it's just all betting shops and vape shops and pound shops and that kind of stuff. So I think there is a general decay of our infrastructure in Britain, but also of our kind of business infrastructure and our civic planning. And the solution always seems to be to apply money from private investment to solve those problems. Whereas usually it brings problems with it. I think one of the things that killed the high street in our town is the fact we've got two big box supermarkets, now three. And so, if you live here and you've got a bit of money to spend, as many people in this area do, it's a lot richer than it was in the 1980s, in terms of the income of people who live here. There's certainly some nice cars parked in the drive. All of that money is going to Little or Morrison's or Asda. And so there's no need for a high street, there's no need for a civic centre, because the people who have the money spend it in the big box stores and then drive back to their house. And so the high street is peopled, as I think I write in the book, by methadone ghosts and the shuttered shells of burned down Costa coffees. That's not acceptable. None of these corporations have a real stake in a city. If you cede the whole of a zone over to Starbucks and ZZ and Morrison's, what's going to happen when nobody's spending money in those places? They're just going to shutter the shop. Whereas, if somebody who had a business there was themselves a part of the infrastructure, a part of the city, then perhaps we'd be less inclined to go spend our money in those big box stores. So yet again, I think like what I was trying to say, beyond analysing what it's like to live in a place that is a place of no place, a place that's just an empty logoscape, I also wanted to talk about the ways in which capitalism eats everything, and it's going to eat our cities too. It's going to eat our culture. The particular city that I was writing about in that essay, I'm sure it does have culture under the surface. In fact, I know it did. I was in town in that particular city for a poetry festival, so I know for a fact that it has stuff going on. It's just very, very hard to see, very, very hard to find, and probably very, very hard to access for most of the citizens that live in that city, if they even know that it exists. So that's another thing that I mean by art can be resistance, is that at the moment we don't have a particularly large amount of very influential or well-known countercultural art. But that certainly wasn't the case, in the era when I grew up. There were lots of countercultural aspects to the art that I consumed and the scenes that I was part of. I'd like to see a return to that. And one way I think that could happen is through the recolonization of corporate space in the cities with art, with activities like skateboarding or face painting or, clown displays or juggling. These are the kinds of things I think that we could do that would look not just like protest, but like an actual reclaiming of space from corporations. I've seen a few people do things like that in the in the kind of like area of protest. Like I had a friend who was an anarchist clown, and they would go and chain themselves dressed as clowns to petrol stations. And it's a good photo opportunity. It's embarrassing for the police having to remove them. It's embarrassing for the corporations to see clowns tied to their petrol pumps. So it's an effective method of protest. But I also think, I really admire the Situationists from the 1960s, and they were quite good at using art to disrupt the social fabric, to draw attention to real social issues. And I feel like faced with these faceless, liminal corporate cities, that's maybe something that we could explore doing, you know?
Following up on that, I've noticed an interesting trend in gaming. As someone who has explored, I guess, these virtual worlds since the PS1 era, I've seen these spaces evolve dramatically to where we are now. Today, many people, including myself, use these virtual environments as community spaces where the experience is now more non-linear and very user-created. However, I've seen increasingly peculiar interactions, like, for example, recently I saw a detailed recreation of a Tesco store on Roblox, and players on this server were role-playing as employees in very much NPC style. Gaming used to be an escape, but now it seems that these spaces are being polluted by the real world mundane. It's like we've shifted from wanting to be the protagonists to preferring the
Mm.
role of NPCs in someone else's world. What are your thoughts on this and virtual spaces kind of moving forward in where they are now?
Mm. Yeah, that's really fascinating and kind of depressing. Um, I mean, it makes me think of like, early internet attempts to kind of disrupt things like The Sims. The famous Habbo Hotel story when the hackers invaded the Habbo Hotel all dressed the same way and just occupied lots of digital space. What it means to be part of an online culture or group is something I find really fascinating as well. I've not much experience of Minecraft Discord servers, but I recognize that such a thing is an organically emerging community where the rules are kind of dictated by the community themselves rather than by Minecraft.org or whoever it is who owns Minecraft. And in terms of the way that I've occupied online space, I started blogging very, very early in the 2000s. I was part of like the Live Journal community. I went from LiveJournal to MySpace, where I learned to code using HTML because you could mess about with the code behind your page and make it do funny things, make it glittery, make it sparkly, do whatever. If you've ever seen that episode where Homer does his own web page, that's what most people's MySpace pages looked like, just bells and whistles and dancing Jesuses. And then from there, moved on to Blogger, started my own platform based on HTML code that was publishing short stories. At that point, I got really interested in online forums. Online forums were nearly always run by somebody renting space on a private server. They were usually themed around a particular niche topic. The one for me was comics. And they were often run by a moderator or a set of moderators who had a certain set of rules that were like a social code in that space. So these were all really positive experiences of being online that like taught me things and made me feel seen and made me connected to communities of people who shared my interests and passions. And really that online forum era was like the last era of that was good. At the same time as that was happening, people were joining Facebook in massive numbers, and it became that pressure to join Facebook or otherwise you'd be missing out, the FOMO. And at that point, Facebook launched Facebook groups. And so all of the forums tried to migrate to Facebook groups. But the problem was Facebook then reduced the functionality. So it became very, very hard to run a forum-like community in Facebook groups and get everyone to see it. Plus, it was also subject to being in the mix in your feed with all the other content from, your mum, your dad, your mate Dave from work. So forums like were murdered by Facebook, like absolutely fucking murdered, just bodied. Sorry for swearing. But I think like that to me shows the risk of like trusting that that an evolving social media technology could replicate that social function that was so important and that was precious and that was ruined by that move onto a new platform, onto a new technology. Or if I think about the way that, social media that I interact with now, like X or Instagram, compare that to MySpace, which allowed me to have my own little player with my songs and let me peek behind the code. That's a very, very different experience from the heavily algorithm curated, adverts jammed down your face every 3 seconds of every platform we use. No platform's exempt from that. They've started doing things like when you pause YouTube, there's an ad there when you pause. So we allowed like the early internet utopian spaces to be colonized by corporations. All of those corporations built their product on the kind of freeware and free code that underpinned the early internet. So the point that I make in the book about digital spaces is that it's probably inevitable that some form of metaverse emerges, by which I mean all of the online communities that we currently have, some form of merger of the servers or space in which they exist that unites them all together. That would be something approaching what happened in the early internet when Tim Berners-Lee invented the web browser. So we're talking about one bit of hero kit or code that connects everything. And at that point, you have the metaverse. Every attempt to build the metaverse so far, like Mark Zuckerberg's version, has been a little walled garden where you would go to have more content pushed at you. It's not the same as an emerging community. But if we allow the technology or the model or the space of this emerging metaverse to be owned by corporations, to be patented and kept behind, in a black box, like the algorithms that run social media currently are, then we could be in trouble very fast. Because what we're really talking about here is building a simulation into which we can retreat from the real world. As you said, games began as escapism. Social media really began as a little bit of escapism, jumping on Twitter to shitpost a little bit. Now it's become an ingrained part of our lives. So if we're going to spend at least some of our time in a simulation, and we already do, but if it's going to become more real, if it's going to become more difficult to tell from reality, and if it's going to become in some way important to us and like as important as real life, as again, social media already feels to many people, then we need to think hard about who's going to own it, because we can already see what the likes of Zuckerberg and Elon Musk want to do with it. And that question of who owns digital space, that's the interesting part for me, because I think despite the best efforts of the platforms, there are still people who build technology platforms, that inherently lend themselves to people building organic communities. It would be a shame if that were to stop. And I think that could be a direct consequence of trying to interfere too much with online space, from the level of a state or a world government or, international regulation of these things. That could actually be a slippery slope to handing over the keys to corporations who can be trusted to moderate it. So while I'm not, in the Elon Musk camp of like calling Twitter the public square, it's not. It's a commercial, curated, limited, walled garden of a space, more and more so. The idea that we might one day share a true digital commons is exciting, but only if that's what it is. If it's a digital panopticon, then they'll own our information. They'll own, our like the way that haptics work is that they track eye movements. All the emotional human responses is in your eye movements. So you don't want that data directly uploaded to corporations, arguably. You think that they have your information now. It's going to be a whole game-changing, different experience when they can record every gesture, every pulse, every hair standing up on the back of your neck. Then they truly own you, lock, stock, and barrel. And I'd say the same is true of things like deepfake technology and artificial intelligence. We're already entering into a world where we encounter simulations and simulacra every waking moment. It's very, very hard now to Google for an image and not find an AI substitute. And as the technology improves, it's going to be harder and harder to separate that boundary between the kind of the products of the digital world from the products of the real world. They're going to be overlaid on top of each other. We're going to be wearing something which puts the adverts behind our eyes. So if that's the case, it's going to be increasingly important for us to be able to build refuges, and probably many of those will be in digital space.
Yeah, your points towards the end there are getting very Philip K. Dick.
It's Philip K. Dick's world, you know, we just live in it.
Many people I know long for this early 2000s internet era, a time that felt like a utopian Wild West. My close friend, Basit Khan, who is himself a multidisciplinary artist and filmmaker, a very good one at that, is creating a website reminiscent of these old forum boards where artists can contribute such things as columns and communicate and share their work in an environment that doesn't feel polluted by these corporate interests. This project and other projects, love to get your opinion on it, but seems like an attempt to reclaim that nostalgic creative freedom, but doing it in our current technological era. What do you think about this movement to recapture and reclaim past digital cultures?
Yeah, the nostalgia for the temporary autonomous zone kind of era of things. My friend Josh Ellis, who I mentioned earlier, is building something that sounds a little similar, and he calls it Kowloon, which is, you know, the Chinese walled city. And the idea is that it's a federated series of blogs and social media that are connected but opt in, and, you know, help you build a network that's a little bit like a forum and a little bit like a following. I mean, it sounds brilliant, and I think the principles that underpin it are good, and I think the Fediverse approach to things has a lot of promise. The problem is that we're already so far down the line of situating our whole lives behind the paywalls of Zuckerberg and Musk and others. It's very hard to extract yourself from that and set up over here. You know, you kind of need a dedicated group of people to come with you. And if anything, I don't know, I think I'd probably find more promise in the idea of what culturally might come from a generation that just puts down the smartphone. I think that we probably won't have a genuinely authentic cultural moment from any generation until that happens, until there's a group of kids who say, the way we're going to be different is that we're not going to have any digital technologies. And obviously that's going to involve a certain degree of sacrifice on their part. It's going to involve a degree of separation from and rejection of societal values. But I think it's almost inevitable that that moment will come. And I think that what comes after that will be interesting if we're still around to see it. You know, and I hope it comes sooner rather than later. You know, like I talked a little bit about rave earlier. You know, I caught the tail end of the rave era. It was very can-do. It was very anti-commercial. It was all about setting up generators in fields and getting the decks going and, you know, getting some drugs in and dancing till 4 a.m. or until the cops came to kick you out. So it was a countercultural activity. I was talking to someone about this, you know, the other day, and like, it's that period of my life from 1997 to 2005. I don't know about any music or any films that aren't like rave records. It's just all I cared about. That's what I did every weekend. And I didn't wear any fashionable clothes. Like when we watch documentaries about, I don't know, the Blitz kids, you know, who started the New Romantics movement, or, you know, Studio 54. A lot of it's about like people dressing up to come out and be seen, to see and be seen. You know, we used to shave our heads and wear white vests and jeans just because you didn't want any hair on because it got really hot when you were dancing. Like it was almost like a cultish moment of just like you could recognize a fellow raver, you know? And so that for me was like a powerful cultural moment without it being connected to any kind of like scene or aesthetic, really. I mean, yeah, we were buying records. We sometimes went to like real nightclubs and paid money to get in and paid for drinks and whatever. But there was a collectivism to it and a countercultural aspect to it that I would like to see re-emerge in culture, and certainly can't see anywhere, least of all the Taylor Swift concert. And it's weird to me. I was going through to Edinburgh on the day of the Taylor Swift concert at Murrayfield, and you know, I could see that I was in the midst of a movement, like Swifties all wearing the same kind of sequined stuff to look good in the lights, which I think she'd asked them to do on her social media. That you know, quite a lot of cowboy hat themed stuff, but like it was all commercially driven. It was all commercially managed. It was all going to take place within a commercial environment, and no matter how collective the experience felt, it still seems to me to be something that you purchase, that you buy into, that you like and subscribe to, you know. And as somebody who was lucky enough to live through a cultural moment that, whatever it was about, largely hedonism, it wasn't about that. Was powerful and empowering and transformative. So I'll be interested to see, because I don't think that kind of moment will be possible from anyone who's filming themselves like that while they do it. It's just not going to happen.
Bram, it's been an absolute pleasure, and I could talk with you all day till the cows come home about all of the topics and your book. Where can people in the UK and US buy the book, and what's next for the future? After tackling the end of the world in the darkest timeline, well, where do you go from here? Or is this really the end of the line?
That's a really good question. Like, if you've written a book about the end of the world, where do you go next, right? I don't know. I'm going to have to figure that out. But certainly, the book is out from Revolt Press. It's worth checking out the website there, revoltpress.com, because they've got some fantastic other books coming up as well, not least of which is Mike Watson's next book, which is about basically digital identity and addiction in capitalism. So I've had a wee read of that, and it's absolutely fantastic. And it's a huge privilege to, be affiliated with Mike and his writing. So I recommend checking out Revolt Press. So yeah, I mean, in terms of what's next for me, I'm working on another book. I'm hopeful that maybe Revolt will take that on, and it's broadly on the topic of the hero's journey and masculinity. So obviously that's something I have a stake in, being a man myself. And I'm very interested in figures like Jordan Peterson and how and why they've become important in our current culture, and what that says about the state of male identity in the current world. So those are the kind of topics that I'm going to be trying to look at and explore next.
Thank you, Bram, for joining us today and sharing your insights from the darkest timeline. I've been Jack Clarke for Arts Express with host Prairie Miller.